Welcome back to the Habit-Based Lifestyle Podcast. I'm your host, Jesse Ewell. Today, we're going to be talking about the habit of jump-starting your brain. I got a very special guest that I'm excited, Mr. Mark Squibb, inventor of LiveO2 therapy. LiveO2 is an oxygen training system, and Mark just let me know that part of this is been the newest Nobel Prize for oxygen therapy that goes back, I think you said it was over 100 years, right?
Yeah, so this last week, they just issued granted a new Nobel Prize for new innovations about how cells use oxygen. And can you believe it's been 100 years since we talked about oxygen as a leading science? The last guy that did it was Otto Warburg when he talked about where does cancer come from. Now, over 100 years later, we're like, okay, here we go, because that was this is 2019, and that was 1913, so that'd be 103 years.
Yeah, that's amazing, man. Well, hey,
110 years.
Yeah, I want to welcome you on the show, and I'm excited you're here. We obviously got to meet last week, and I just heard a lot about your story, but I had no idea what this thing was capable of, and we had a mutual friend recommend it several times. So I'm like, all right, I might as well have Mark on and find out exactly what this does before I get one myself. So how did this all start for you?
Well, there's probably four simultaneous stories, but I'll tell the first one, which is that, I've been working too hard for too long, and I'm like, man, it sure would be nice if I could start every day without being a goofball. So first was I spent some years building software companies, and I'm like, if I could be any smarter, it would do me some good.
Yeah.
And then same time or thereabouts, I had my house burned down. Well, kids ended up with some seizures, and I realized that he had had some chemical damage. So I ended up being very concerned as a parent about wanting to get my boy back and get him put together. About the same time, my mom got cancer, and that drew me in to take a look at this, this whole health problem. I was personally involved. I had two people I love very much that were, having an issue, and I'm like, man, I got to do something about this. And so about the same time, I started really studying cell physiology. My background is an engineer, so I tend to think of things as capacitors and how do things work and supply chain. And when I started to dig into this oxygen, I saw a brand new world of ways to modulate the body and get things fired up. And I can't believe it took the Nobel guys, 100 years to come back around on this. Right. But one of the fun things that, I find and I try to do about every day is we developed a system for jump-starting the brain.
Okay. So let me ask you this. What was the first thing that you actually picked up and kind of had this aha moment? I'm on to something, or now I'm starting to see, possibly what happened or what I could work on.
Well, I was working with a sports team, basically the Cleveland Browns, and I was commuting to Cleveland every week, and mostly I was working with linemen, and those guys get beat up pretty bad. And then there was one lineman over there that had enough concussions that he was at the leading edge of the football CTE problem. And so I was working with him, and then I was working with a bunch of the other guys that had God knows how many injuries, and they were always injured all the time. So I was working in it and just started developing accelerated recovery process. Okay. And so about the same time as when all this other stuff happened, so I had some, I'll call it really good folks to work with that were in a hurry to heal. So one of the things that hit me was when I started working with this kid named Brodney. Not really a kid, he's a pro football player, but he had almost lost his ability to play. And when we started working with him, literally in a week, his ability to come back. And I saw that, and I didn't know what was going on. And at that time, it was actually before this whole NFL deal kind of came on, but there was his story, and at the same time, my son had some chemical injury, and we saw both the seizures and the loss of mental function. And I was like, wow, something's going on here. So when we when I started using this, and I just started developing it as a personal, I'll call it anti-aging training system. And I started doing brain tests on everybody, or, the folks I was working with, including myself. I mean, literally we saw overnight improvements in brain function. So that was my real hint that something profound was happening. So, that was the beginning. And then over the past, 7, 8 years, we've worked with many people and pretty much the same result every time. But if it's not really a therapy, it's more of a training. So we've evolved it into the point where it's a simple workout that you can do almost every day.
Okay. So this all kind of happened, what, 7, 8 years ago, maybe a little bit more?
Yeah, I started this I think I had my first experience, or, my first motion back in about 2008, which would be almost 11 years ago now. And what had happened was that there was this guy named Manfred von Ardenne, who was a truly profound scientist out of Germany, and he was working with oxygen, and he wrote a book named Oxygen Multi-Step Therapy. And he went through and he did the original founding research on oxygen. And the history of that was, before he did it, they'd always give you oxygen, but you'd sit there, or somebody's sick and you'd breathe it. And he says, well, I think if we do some exercise while we're breathing oxygen, as in oxygen training, then it might make a difference. And he studied that from about 1970 to when he died, and I think about 1995. Well, it was more recent, maybe 2000. I should know my dates better. But the long story short is he did about 30 years and just totally outrageous research. The main thing that he discovered was there's this phenomenon called the tourniquet effect, which is if you have a stress event or an injury that blocks blood flow to a tissue for 90 minutes. And what happens is the vascular system itself is injured. And then when the vascular system is injured, it's not mechanically injured, but the hypoxia or loss of oxygen causes the vascular system basically to close down most of the way, so that any tissue that's served by that goes into what is basically a permanent state of no oxygen. And then as we age, this effect that builds up through our life as a result of stress events or concussions ends up shutting down different parts of our body. And what he discovered is that if you supersaturate the blood and squirt it hard enough to go through these, I'll call it blockages or occlusions, then you can punch through and it'll open up and start working again. So what we were seeing, or I guess I'd call it what I was seeing with like my son and these football players and myself, is that when we train in a way that basically maximize the oxygen and simultaneously maximize the oxygen in the blood flow, we could actually break through, and all this tissue in the body that had stopped working would basically fire up. And so
this is like breaking through the blood-brain barrier.
Yeah, I won't call it the blood-brain barrier. It's about breaking through the congestion. So, like in the concussion cases, the kids they'd hit their head, and then the brain would get smushed up against one side, and it usually would bounce back and smush up against the other side. So you had bruises inside the brain. Okay. And what we were doing was we were creating enough blood flow and pressure simultaneously, more or less, to push through the closures in the vascular system and reoxygenate the brain. And what we were seeing in terms of their recoveries is the brain would just switch back on, in minutes, because all it needed was some oxygen. And so when we started doing this, and we've been doing this for, I guess I really got serious about the brain protocols in about 2013.
Okay.
But what happened then was we really started to see, because the story goes like this. I was working out, and then we went skiing over the weekend, and we skied up to a place called Cameron Pass. And when we got up to about 11,000 feet, man, all I could hear was my heart pounding in my head. And then I'm like, that's interesting. There's a lot of blood flow to my brain. So I came back and dug up the research, and it turns out that, when you work out hard enough to hear your heart pounding in your head, your body's squirting about 4 times more blood than normal through your brain. Okay, but you could only really establish that circuit when you're on top of a mountain, because you had to have your body hungry enough for oxygen that it would amplify the amount of blood. So to really create that, you had to train at high altitude, which is kind of the opposite of oxygen rich.
Right. And
So,
so, when somebody gets to that place, what actually happens to them?
so the physiology is kind of basic. So our bodies are primed, or they're designed. So, like, for example, if you're working out real hard and the available oxygen to the brain starts to drop, the body will bump the heart rate and it'll open up all the veins or arteries to the brain to make sure the brain has enough oxygen. But you'll notice that most people will only get to that heart pounding in the head phase when they're running up a hill or exercising hard enough. But the blood flow circuit is actually triggered by a decrease in oxygen to the brain. Okay, so once the body perceives that decrease, that, hey, I need to send more blood to the brain, then it'll open it up and it'll maximize the flow.
Okay.
So as I'm experiencing this, I'm like, I think I could cheat. So I came back home and we were doing, what I'll call, oxygen only reservoirs. So I modified a reservoir to go ahead and simulate an altitude, and I put a switch on it.
Okay.
Okay, so now you can work out, or I started working out and I get to the point where I got the heart pounding in the head. So I got the circuit active, then I throw a switch. Next breath, boom, maximum oxygen to the brain. And so that allowed me, for at least a brief period of time, maybe, a few seconds, to establish a simultaneous maximum of the volume of blood flowing through the brain. But while you're in that state, your heart and lungs are going boom, boom, boom. So you're also getting a maximum amount of oxygen into the blood. So you got simultaneous maximum blood flow and maximum oxygen concentration. So now there's an important point. The blood has different ways of carrying oxygen. So if you talk medical, what you'll see is that, well, it's only on the hemoglobin. Well, hemoglobin is the red blood cells. But it turns out a lot of oxygen will dissolve in the plasma, or the water part of the blood.
Sure.
So and what we were doing was we're maximizing the amount of oxygen in the water part of the blood. So even if the brain had a bruise and the red blood cells wouldn't go through, the wet part of the blood would. So, and this is looping back to Manfred von Ardenn's research, what he discovered is that once you get to a magic threshold of about 4 times normal, four atmospheres, which before the Live O2 experience, you can only really get to in a $250,000 military hyperbaric chamber. Anyways, when we started doing this, we could establish the maximum blood. And what was happening is we were punching through and reoxygenating the brain. And if somebody had an loss of brain function or hangover or anything where their brain wasn't working because the brain wasn't getting enough oxygen, it would switch back on.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think, for people listening, I kind of wanted you to explain it to give them, like, whether you're an athlete or, maybe a businessman too, maybe a stay-at-home mom, having 4 times the amount of oxygen to your brain is going to help you, whether you're in one of those places. It's going to help anybody. And like you said, like, I think pretty much all of us have had some type of injury to our head, or possibly stress, trauma, something. And so this really, what I'm hearing, is going to impact this in a positive way and kind of redrive the circuits in the brain to get them to start working again, or at least get more oxygen to the brain.
Yeah. The story is actually a little better. And I'm sorry if I forgot to say this, but what the research basically, once you get that circuit active, it's 4 times more blood.
Wow.
But when you throw the oxygen switch, it's 6 times more oxygen.
Okay.
So if you take 4 times more blood times 6 times more oxygen, what you're actually doing is creating an oxygen delivery potential in the brain that's 24 times normal.
Wow. Yeah,
okay, so, and that was kind of the magic, because when you take, it doesn't matter who you are. You could be, like you say, you can be an executive or a housewife or, a kid. that's trying to be an athlete, any sort of athlete, as soon as you super oxygenate the brain, it's going to work better. And so what we started to see is like, and this was, a personal story, was because, I've been managing companies for a long time. My ability to manage a company and talk to people and to be able to think fast enough to be able to be nice all the time
Yeah.
made a huge difference in my career. Because, if you're an executive, there's a real tendency for people to do things that you might consider stupid.
Right.
And having the self-discipline and the mental control not to, to be able to react to them constructively ended up making a huge difference in my ability to, have better relationships in the company. And so once I sort of caught on to this, the next thing I did was like, since I saw somebody acting in a way that I couldn't understand, I was like, yeah, maybe I ought to get them one. So now in the company, everybody starts their day the same way, which is get your butt on Live O2, work out, so Mark doesn't have to spend as much time irritated.
Nice. So yeah, I mean, I could see how even moms reacting, being home with their kids all day, and then they get into this reactive mode. It's like, hey, let's starting your day with this, or like you said, the managers, executives, all of this is super powerful. One of the things that I wanted to ask you about this was, a lot of the work where you originally started out were people with concussions, people with, like your son. When did you know that after you've seen, your son or these guys with concussions, like when did you see these guys like, man, we can actually like change, the world with this thing and change people's lives? But because I think that's super powerful that you're able to do that.
Well, the thing that really caught me by surprise early was how fast the response. And if you don't mind, I can bring up a little document that kind of shows a couple of CNS or brain
Yeah,
function
go ahead,
tests.
bring it up.
Okay, give me a second here. I'm assuming you can edit or you pause it.
Yeah, either way, man, we can it'll come up on the screen.
No problem.
I think you just got to ask me to share.
Okay. Sorry, I'm just looking here.
Should be in the bottom middle of the screen.
No, I have no trouble. No, I'm looking on mine
Okay.
because I've got these things in PDF files. So I'm just trying to get my recent PDF up here so I can do a good job sharing it. That's a DC. All right. Come on. I don't want to do a. I had it open. Adobe. All right. I'm going to go get the docs. Pardon me.
Okay. Yeah, so what you're bringing in is what somebody looks like kind of before they do Live O2, and then what they actually look like after just one session, right?
I've got sessions, one session, and then I've got weekly series. We've done a number of recoveries. So let me get down here. Let's see. Research. Brain O2. Cases.
Do you want to just include it in the show notes?
There we go. Now we're getting there. Okay, now I got another good one here. Chill. Sorry, I didn't think to do this before.
Yeah, no worries.
All right. Okay. Now let's see. Share. Where's share? There's share. There we go. Okay. Can you see me?
Yep, I can see you.
Okay, this is my son who was 11 at the time. And, what had happened was we started to see some just Tourette seizures. And it made me wonder about what was going on with him. And so I obtained this program called CNS, which is basically a pretty standard neurological panel. And anyway, any day you as a dad turn around and to give your son a test and you see that these scores are all over here in this very low category, I promise it's not a good day.
Yeah.
And I'm like, what in the world is going on with my son's brain? So, the next place I went was, come along and say, okay, well, I really need to do something about this. And I was working with Livo 2. So I said, okay, Dakota, let's train. Now, by the way, it was easy because he's an athlete and was practicing archery. And when he discovered it would make him a better archer, he was all over it. So
Right.
he got on there and he trained on Monday afternoon. Okay. I gave him another test on Wednesday. Within 48 hours, he went from 7 in the low category to 3 in the low category.
Wow. Very low.
Yeah, very low category. I'm sorry. But the point was the X's were marching to the left. Okay, now he turned 19 last week, and he's all pretty much in this above average with a few scores in average. And
Okay.
he was able to learn to speak a new language in 30 days.
Wow.
So I'm very confident that whatever was wrong here is no longer wrong as he rolls into adulthood. The other thing that, mom said was, we have always homeschooled, was that, his scholastic performance really started to rebound at this point, and it was amazing. So this was the first one, and it's kind of
So this happened for him at age 11. And this is after 2 treatments, or
this is after one This is after one training.
Okay.
And then if I get over here, I can show you another thing. I should have opened this up before, which is let's move forward to now. Okay, and this was July 21st of 2017. So a year and a half ago. But you'll see here that most of his scores have moved all the way over, and at this point, his scores are mostly in the well above average. So I mean, it wasn't like a miracle where he was overnight recovered, because when there's different types of things that happen in the brain. So this was a chemical damage, meaning that was kind of all over the brain. But over time, he was able to bounce right back.
Yeah, and I guess again, this is about building a habit of jumpstarting your brain, and so any habit, whether it's working out or whatever, you're not going to always see the result right away. But here you are actually seeing a result right away. 2 days later, but the more you do it, obviously, you get the result that actually sticks. So how often did he train?
Yeah, so in the period between these two, he trained about twice a week. Okay, but it was actually easy. So as being a parent, getting him to train was easy because he was an archer or an athlete, and so he would be like, okay, I got a competition, I'm going to train up, because what he found was that when he'd shoot archery, his group would go from this to this. Okay, and he liked winning. So he wasn't training to fix his brain. He was training to kick ass.
Right.
And the fact that me as a parent didn't have to guide him, he was just on it, made it really easy for me to do. And I knew back behind the scene that, while he was doing this, his brain was healing, and I just got to watch him flourish as a student and, as a social being, where he had great relationships with all his friends. And it made my job as a parent easy because, I mean, what a fun kid to hang out with. I'm going to drift into another story, which is a little different timeline. Here's a story about a woman named Jill, and our house burned down and we had to move to town, and I was over to party across the street. And basically, she says, I met her. I said, oh, how you doing? And she said, oh, my life sucks. I'm like, my goodness, what happened? And she says, oh, I had 3 concussions over the past 18 months, and they have ruined my life. I'm like, oh, geez. And I had remembered the story about what happened with Dakota, and I just looked at her and I said, I think I might be able to help if you're willing to trust me a little bit. And she says, pretty much, I got nothing to lose.
Right.
So I had her come over, and this is the same test. And so the important point about this one was, this is back in 2013. And the first test we took was 11 o'clock in the morning. And if you look here, you see all of these reds. These are neurological scores that were basically in the very low category.
Okay.
So she trained, and, she just kind of bounced back immediately. So the second test is at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So approximately 2 hours later.
Okay.
So if you look at this, you'll see that, her reaction time went from a first column, which is very low, to well above average. Very low, above average. Very low to average. Very low to average. So what was interesting is, in that one workout, in only 2 hours, these parts of her brain that she needed to have to use flip back on.
Wow, like turning on the light switch.
Turning on the light switch. And I'm looking at this, I'm like, what? You got to be kidding me. And then that's when I started to realize that, a lot of the loss of function in the brain was a result of, these kind of bruises, and the brain wasn't actually injured a lot of the times. And if you could turn the blood flow back on, back to that, okay, get that circuit going and blast it with 24 times more than normal, boom, it popped back on.
Okay.
And so, and the next question that comes in here, and so, I worked with her again. Let's see, this is 2013. This is about a week later. So she came back a week later, and some of her scores continued to improve. And then the question everybody asks, like, yeah, Mark, that's great. How long does it last? So I reached out to her back in, July of 2017, and I had her take another test. So roughly 4 years later, everything that she accomplished in the first sessions with no repeated trainings was still there.
Oh, so she only did those like week-long training, 3 sessions.
Yeah, it was 3 sessions over 2 to 3 weeks.
So, wow, that's amazing. So why did she ever end up getting one, or did you say, hey, if you keep doing this?
Well, I said, look, you probably want to think about this, but the problem was, back in this time frame, she was so traumatized from being, she's an artist. Right. She was so traumatized both financially, because she'd lost her income. She couldn't work. Okay, so, say, hey, you ought to get one of these for home. It didn't make any sense to her, because she couldn't afford it, because she hadn't been able to work for the past 18 months. Okay, so, after here, so she had, 2 years worth of catching up, because she couldn't make any money, so it's only now, like several years later, I can go back to her and say, hey, maybe you ought to get one of these so that you can, stay on top of your game. But that's the thing that goes on when you're working with somebody that's been injured like that. Their whole life is so messed up, and unless they've got a support network, like, if you're a parent, you got a kid that's playing football or something like that, or if you're an executive and you say, wow, I need to be at the top of my game every day, it's sometimes hard to justify a purchase, because you can't know what's going to happen. And the other point would be, when we did this, I didn't know this was going to happen. I mean, to me, it was an experiment. So I couldn't in good faith say, oh, this is going to fix you, because I hadn't done it enough times to be able to feel like I was telling her the truth.
Right. Yeah. And I like, the first thing I think of is, people that are kind of chronically stressed, people that are in like a parasympathetic phase, or even people that are overweight. Like, I don't know if you've ever done studies on maybe weight loss on this, or like just the mindset of people who are overweight is it's got to be like a constant stress to worry and think about having to lose weight or having to do that, just like somebody would be around stress. So I don't know if you've ever done that, but it would be interesting to.
Well, we actually do it all the time.
Okay.
So like most people that end up getting a LiveO2, they do it for a whole list of reasons. Number one, I mean, we're talking about being smarter all the time here. That's always a good thing. But a lot of people that have, the mental function, they also end up feeling tired, fatigue, depression, right, and stuff like that. And it turns out, like in the same thing, like at 11 o'clock in the morning, Jill was depressed. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, she was happy as a clam. It turned out, yeah, there were things that were wrong in specific parts of her brain that were injured, but there were other things that were happening. And when we oxygenate her brain, many of those things went away. Now, to get to the weight point, when you're depressed and you're tired all the time, you don't feel good enough to do much.
Right.
So after now, since we did this first experiment, we've positioned or placed, several thousand LiveO2 systems, and people that have a weight problem, they will drop between 5 and 15 pounds by doing nothing more than working out for 15 minutes a day.
Right.
And do you work with many, like performance athletes?
Yeah, I have several. Yeah, I've worked with them several times, and like Division I athletes, stuff like that. So yeah.
Well, one of the other fun ones is we did, I'll call it a pilot study. It's just a case study. So there's an N equal 1 at this point. I mean, we've got quite a few observations, but we did an 11-week training program with a fellow where we did, he was kind of he is a student. He just went back to school. He'd been working in the pharmaceutical industry for a while. Anyway, so we did a VO2 max test on him before he started LiveO2. And then we did a second VO2 max test on him at the end of the first week. All right, let me throw you a question. How much VO2 max do you think he gained in 7 15-minute workouts?
I would say probably double.
He gained 8% measured VO2 max.
Okay. Wow.
Okay. Then he went back. We would let it ride for a month. So he went, I think it was either 4 or 5 weeks. All right, take another guess. How much, and this is 15-minute day, 15-minute workout a day. How much VO2 max do you think he gained by the end of the 5th week?
20%.
You got it, 18%.
Oh, wow.
Okay, and then he went for 11 weeks. So guess what his exit success rate at week number 11 was?
I don't know.
30%, dropped 9 pounds.
Wow. Yeah, that's amazing.
And this is, and the point would be, it wasn't about that, but as his energy level went up, he was able to be more active all the time. The other thing, he called me, he says, "Mark, you ruined my life." I'm like, "What?" He said, "I went to a Christmas party. I had to drink 4 times more to get a buzz." Because what had happened, when we're doing this thing about getting your brain going, what happens is the body squirts so much more blood through the liver, heart, and kidneys that his whole natural detox process and his liver started working so much better that he was processing, if you just take it at face value, maybe it was only 2 times as much, but he was twice as able to eliminate toxins from his body. So he had to drink more
Wow.
to party.
And yeah, the thing I'm looking at is you have, visual memory, verbal memory, composite memory. You have reaction time, attention, flexibility, speed. Like these are all things that we look for like every day in life, whether it's, just functioning better at whatever we're doing in life or being an athlete. Like this really can help anybody, not just, athletes. And so I think that's really cool that you're able to track all this stuff and actually see the improvement of somebody.
Yeah, I'm going to show you a couple more things here. All right, this is my personal story. Okay, so, again, I don't have any known head injuries or anything like that. I'm just a guy trying to run a company. But, when I did the first experiment with Dakota, I'm like, well, what's this going to do for me? So, this is the same day, May 11th. All right, and this is my starting score. I'm kind of average, low average, and I was pretty well stressed out. So whatever. Anyway, I trained with Dakota. All right, these are my Wednesday 48-hour later scores after 1 training session. All my X's moved left to 2. And as far as I know, I wasn't all that messed up.
Yeah, I mean, you just got better.
I got better, and I was like, that's when I started to realize that, if I'm trying to work or do any kind of job, it doesn't matter if I work with my hands or my mind or I'm on the phone, anything that I can do to be just a little bit sharper is well worth the investment. And I'm like, wow, that would be a really great way for me to start my day.
Yeah. I mean, I've worked out for like 30 years, but it's like I'm all about looking at, okay, how do I maximize my workouts? How do I maximize? Because really for me, I'm working out because of what it gives me for the rest of my day. I did the thing for a long time where it was about, okay, how does my biceps look? How do my chest look? But now I'm at the place where I'm like, okay, how do I leverage what I got from my workout and bring that into my relationships, not only with my wife, my kids, my clients, but also how does this affect how I show up in everyday life, encompassing my whole person. And I think that's really cool is what I'm hearing is it just makes you better at life.
It makes your body happier.
Yeah.
And one of the things, there's a couple of different points. So a lot of people out there, in our high stress lifestyle, I mean, it's really easy to go 2, 3, 4 years without working out. You see
Yeah.
a lot of that. It's like you get tied up in your work and you're like, oh, and then, we're always used to thinking, oh, gee, if I'm going to work out, it's got to hurt, because I'm going to go work out. My muscles are going to be sore. And a lot of people will put off getting started because they know it's going to hurt. And so one of the other things that we discovered was, I'll call it, I won't go on the science, but basically almost nobody that trained with Live O2 has ever gotten sore. I'm not saying it's impossible, but very few people. And that gets into some science, but basically whenever you got a sore muscle, the mechanism says, or popular philosophy says, well, I've got too much lactic acid in the muscle, therefore it's sore because the muscle's, trending acidic.
Right.
Well, what we discovered when we were doing this training, especially with the pro athletes, I mean, the big one was I was training some of these guys, in Cleveland, they're 340 pounds. What was happening, they'd be beat up and stuff, and they'd try to train, and then I'd train them, and then they'd be like, uh-oh, but they've got 340 pounds of body mass. They would get off the system, and all of their soreness would be gone. Or most of it, I should say. Okay, but the really big surprise was I'd see them reach down and kind of rub underneath their right rib cage. And when I see them do that, I just say, you don't want to be trusting any farts for the next hour or so. Because what was happening was all of their soreness was because of this inflammation that I talked about with Ardennes. They had overstressed and the blood flow to the muscles had been compromised. When we super oxygenated the capillaries in that muscle, all those capillaries opened up, and all the lactic acid that was being built in the muscle would wash out in the bloodstream and go to the liver, and they'd have to get rid of it. Okay. And it's like, now that's really interesting. These guys started training sore, but by the time they were finished, they were not sore. Now, this doesn't happen to most people because, like, these guys are 300 plus pounds of muscle. Sure. So when you release all of that lactic acid from the muscle, it's too much for the liver. But, the point is, like on a regular workout, if you're training hard, if you use Live O2 at the backside of that workout, you will be vastly less sore and you'll recover from your workout in about half normal time.
Wow. Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, I don't know anything else that can do that.
It makes you smarter, makes you feel better. And I mean, I tell you what, I'm just having so much fun, helping people and, seeing them, live much better quality of life. And it's just ridiculously fun.
Yeah, this looks amazing.